For the first time, Iran will take part in talks in Syria. Many say if there's to be a diplomatic resolution to the conflict, Iran must be involved. But as its generals and soldiers continue to die in Syria, what's at stake for the Iranian government? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Being invited to join world powers discussing how to end Syria's war must feel like vindication for the government of Iran. It is the first time the United States has chosen to engage with Iranian leaders on Syria. That's despite the fact that Iranian troops are deeply involved in what's happening on the ground, providing military advisors, weapons and training to Syrian government forces. But for many, Iran's presence at this weekend's talks in Vienna shows that Tehran's political isolation could be ending. But in Syria, at least, it has come at a high price. Over the last few weeks, several Iranian military personnel have been killed on Syria's battlefields. And that has forced the Iranian government to publicly acknowledge their deaths, and some say may have given it a reason to take part in these talks. Iran has long said its soldiers are serving in Syria in a purely advisory role. But the increasing number of those killed shows they are involved in some of Syria's most active front lines. Among those killed just this month are Brigadier General Reza Merat, who died in the northern Hama province. Two Revolutionary Guard commanders, both colonels, were killed in southern Syria on October the 13th. And one of Iran's best-known generals, Hussein Ahmadian, was killed in the outskirts of Aleppo earlier this month. So lots to discuss on today's Inside Story. Let's bring in our guests immediately. In London, Arron Reza Merat, Iran analyst for the Economic Intelligence Unit. In Tehran, we have Hassan Ahmadian, Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Tehran. And also in London, Julian Barnes-Dacey, Senior Policy Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Let me start off with you, Hassan Ahmadian, if I may, talking about these rather high-profile deaths when it comes to the military. How did they die, considering, according to the Iranian leadership, they are only there in an advisory role?
Well, considering the level of the people, or the level of the dead people in Syria, the deaths, all of them are commanders. That means if Iran is involved in more operational level, or an Iranian army, so to speak, have been there, we should have been witnessing low profile, actually, people dead, or soldiers, or low, not commanders and generals. So I think this deaths of the generals and commanders actually indicates the reality of the Iranian presence in there, which is advisory. Well, they have been advising on the, on the ground, so the deaths happened. But
I think that many of these deaths are apparently through gun battles. So does that suggest that we are looking at advisory roles here? Or was it more than that?
Where there are different levels of advisory roles. This is operational one. I think the commanders, the mere fact that the commanders have been killed there indicates that they were advisors to the operations that have been there.
What do you make of this, Arron Reza Merat? Is that true, or do you think that we're seeing a greater level of involvement by the Iranians in the form of battle, fighting on the ground?
It's an incredibly murky situation. Iran's military footprint in Syria has been, according to the Iranian government, just about protecting the Shia shrines in the region. Other people say that they're giving forward operating advice to Russian aircraft who are bombing Syria at the moment. Other people say that there are whole battalions there. To be completely frank, anyone who says they know what's going on in the situation isn't being entirely honest. We do know that the Revolutionary Guards has a large footprint there. The Al-Quds part of the Revolutionary Guard, which does foreign operations. And it seems likely to me that they are an umbrella organisation which is assisting Hezbollah and the Syrian army, as well as the popular mobilisation forces in Syria. It seems to be that they're going to be they're more in a managerial operations position than they are providing cannon fodder in Hama and Idlib province, it seems.
What do you make of it, Julian? In fact, before I go to you, Hassan, you were shaking your head there. What was wrong with that?
I mean, the popular mobilization is in Iraq, not in Syria. Iran, of course, has been cooperating with Hezbollah and other forces in favor of President Assad. But I don't think there is any popular mobilization in Syria. And that the point that Iran is involved, I agree, I totally agree. But the level of the involvement is not like an Iranian an Iranian division is there. Iran is supporting and advising those people who are fighting to the extremist groups in there.
Julian Barnes-Dacey, what's your viewpoint?
Oh, well, I think it's clear that the Iranians have had a large footprint in Syria for quite some time. I suspect that in terms of the official mobilization, the numbers aren't so high, but certainly advisory capacity there is a strong element. And I think when you talk about Iran, you also have to talk about the non-state militias, the likes of Hezbollah, that have effectively been brought to Syria in quite large numbers under Iranian instruction. And I think really you have to look at those as one and the same in many respects. Iran sees Syria as a front line of a regional war and is investing a lot. And you're going to see more and more Iranian numbers there. And I believe even this week, a deputy Iranian foreign minister acknowledged an increased Iranian military presence over the last month as the Russians have moved into Syria. So I don't think we should be surprised by these deaths. I don't think we should be surprised that they're happening at the front lines. They are clearly active military participants, maybe not in thousands, but in critical numbers in key areas, often in those more advisory roles that are so significant.
Now, earlier this week, the deputy commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Hossein Salami, addressed public concerns about Iranian deaths in Syria. In an extensive interview, he said they must visit the scene and must get to know the realities on the ground in order to be able to advise. They cannot sit in rooms and help the Syrian army. Who was this message for, Hassan? And did it allay Iranian concerns? And I'm talking about the public here.
I think he meant to address those doubts that have been raised against Iran's role in the Syrian scene, mainly in the regional level. I mean, mainly Arab media who have been accusing Iran of being on the ground and fighting for the Syrians. He was saying that, well, an advisor to a front line like in Syria, to the scene in Syria, cannot sit in the room. This is the level that I've been speaking about, that there are different levels of involvement and advisory roles. Iran's advisory role is more deeply involved on the ground, I think, and that's why those commanders have been killed in the battleground or near the battleground, the front.
Okay, yeah. But I'd like to talk about the sort of impact it's having on the country, on those in the public. I mean, they are seeing the body count growing. You have these public funerals, so they know what's going on. They're getting a sense of the growing threat on their doorstep. How's it playing out there amongst them?
I think there are differing point of views on what is happening in there and Iran's involvement in there, but I think the main narrative, which is the ruling elite's narrative, which says that if we don't help our allies to defeat the extremists, they will come to our borders and we have to fight them in here, is well understood on a popular level. That's why Iran's, I think, to my assessment, Iran's public is not gets the message, gets the narrative, and it's I don't think there are, of course, concerns about the increasing deaths, but I don't think that is creating any change or any pressure to change Iran's policy in Syria.
Arron, well, it certainly looks like it from this point of view. There seems to be a growing propaganda campaign within Iran, if I can put it that way. For example, Qasem Soleimani, he's a commander of the Quds in the Revolutionary Guard. He was a man who lived in the shadows. We know that he fought in Iraq. Only after he came back to Iran, we know that he's in Syria. Now we see that he's got an Instagram account. What do you make of that? Is it making Iran's possibly growing role more acceptable?
In terms of Iranian propaganda around its position in Syria, it is interesting. The Iranians have usually operated kind of in cloak and dagger with their adventures abroad. However, it just shows how it understands that its position in Syria has largely been legitimized. The Americans aren't doing anything in Syria, and as far as Iran sees, it needs to step up to Saudi-sponsored extremism in the Middle East. You've got to look at the fact that from Iran's position, it sees that if it doesn't back Bashar al-Assad, Syria will fall to Saudi Arabia, and then it will present real problems for its militias in Lebanon. And as the other guest mentioned, Iran faces Saudi-sponsored extremism in Baluchistan, in Pakistan, and in Afghanistan. And if more of the Middle East falls to under Saudi influence, Iran may see bombs in its own territory in decades to come. So it really sees it's trying to stem the problem early, but by backing Assad, essentially, as unpalatable as that seems.
I mean, Julian, do you think that is the main reason for Iran being there, to offset Saudi Arabia, to step in the void that the US have left, keep Israel at bay? Not sure that that's working, though.
Well, I think this is clearly about Iran defending its regional position. Obviously, it's got strong allies in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and in Iraq, the central government. But it sees what's happening in Syria as kind of the central battleground in this larger strategic war against the Saudis, but also against the West, who it believes want to get it. And they really fear that if their influence in Syria is curtailed, that will have a knock-on effect in terms of Sunni states moving on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that will, of course, impact its deterrent against Israel. There are also fears that in turn could threaten its allies in Iraq. So really, Syria is the central battleground, much as the Sunni Arab states view it as the place where they can try and regain a foothold in the face of what they perceive as unwelcome Iranian influence in the meddling. So for both sides, the way that Syria goes is the way that their own regional influence goes.
Because it's one of the few countries in the Middle East that's not been fought over because of its resources. Isn't that right, Julia? I mean, rather it's geopolitical.
It's a strategic, exactly. It's a strategic location. It's a politics. I mean, Iran needs Syria to get weapons into Hezbollah and Lebanon. As the other guests have mentioned, they fear that if Syria falls, you'll have a tidal wave of Sunni-backed militants moving down into Lebanon and across into Iraq. So geographically, obviously, it's very important. So it's the crux, it's the centerpiece of this broader strategic battle with deep implications. And in many ways, they view it as a defensive war. Even though they're seen in the West and in the region to be on the offensive in the region, they think that the measures that they're taking in Syria, the backing that they're giving to Assad, is a defensive measure for their allies in the region and ultimately for attacks that could move into Iran itself.
Now, in the 4 years of fighting, control of territory has changed hands many times. It is a war of attrition that has left the government's forces on the back foot, defending state institutions and their strongholds in the east. The political vacuum has left the door open for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant to make huge gains, most recently in the central corridor. The Syrian opposition controls large parts of the north and southwest, making gains in Deraa and Quneitra. There have also been advances for al-Nusra Front, most recently the provincial capital of Idlib in the northwest. The Kurdish Popular Protection Units, or the YPG, have also been battling ISIL for control of their territory. And this is what government forces control. So little, in fact, that in July, President Assad conceded that his troops are overstretched and can't be in all areas of the country. If you look at how little he controls, Hassan, why still so much support for Bashar al-Assad? Isn't he a man of the past?
Beside what your guests have said about the Syrian war being having, regional dimensions, we should pay attention to the facts, the demographic geography of Syria. There are 70% of the Syrian population under the government's rule. They move actually from the rebel-held areas to government-held provinces and areas. That means in times of crisis, of course, the demographic geography matters the most. I think the Syrian government still is ruling 70%, and that indicates that this is a crucial party, the main party in any settlement in the future. I mean, when the people choose between a rebel-held area and a government-held area, they move to the government-held area. Although, if they find a way, they get out of the country. But, the choice between the rebels and the government is always have been the government-held area. And Iran actually, beside these facts, Iran actually Iran is concerned about the more regional geostrategic changes that are coming out of the Syrian scene. Iran's acts in Syria has been react to Saudis and other parties backing the rebels at the first place. I mean, on a military level, Iran has been reactive to those actions. But on political level, Iran has been willing and almost struggled to be a part of a solution that can bring this mess into an end. I mean, the Syrian crisis has cost Iran a lot, and there is no any good perspective. But Iran's narrative is based on one, there is no good alternative right now, and so to speak about the Assad stepping down, and second, that any settlement should bear in mind and should address actually tackle the terrorism issue, which is ISIS and a lot of those extremist groups fighting Assad. Without addressing them, the geostrategic position of Syria will harm the entire security of the region. That's Iran's perspective and narrative about Syria, and that's why they are supporting the government still until today.
Arron, for all those reasons, it's clear why Iran is an important player in the country, why Iran should be at the table at these talks. But if you've got such polar opposite ideas when it comes to Bashar al-Assad, when you look at Iran's position and the position of the US camp, how do you reach an agreement?
Clearly, it's going to be very difficult. I think there's going to be much more wriggle room around the fate of Bashar al-Assad than the press and all of the respective parties have mooted so far. They're going in with maximal positions at the beginning. The Americans have shifted their position from Assad must go to maybe Assad can stay for a while. The British also. The Iranians have said that, quote unquote, Assad doesn't, we don't expect Assad to be staying in Syria forever. I think when they meet up, what's key is that the Saudis and the Iranians are going to be in the same room. Now, the Iranians have been extending opportunities for the Saudis to engage in diplomacy with Iran around the Syria question for literally years. And whichever analysis you go down, at the end of the day, Iran and Saudi, being the biggest ideological and military kind of players in this scene, need to talk. And as far as my reading of the situation goes, Iran is willing to talk to Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is extremely suspicious of Iran's intentions. Now,
Julian, do you think that's key to success?
Well, I don't expect anything from these talks, to be honest. I think the upside is great. We finally got inclusive talks, including the likes of Iran, which is long overdue. But there's an ongoing, insurmountable gap between the two sides over the question of Assad. And I just don't see the Iranians willing to budge on that. For the Russians and for the Iranians, Assad is a guarantor. Without him, there's no security in terms of what comes next, in terms of guaranteeing their interests. And for the likes of the Saudis, the Assad must go line prevails. And so even if the likes of the US and the Brits and others are growing tired and moderating their position, so long as the Saudi and the Iranians continue to knock heads over this fundamental problem, I don't see any short-term hope from these Vienna talks. So, you know, at best, I think one should acknowledge that it's positive that you're finally getting inclusive regional talks, a recognition that you need to bring all sides in, and perhaps there will be some sense that these talks need to move forward. But until one of the two sides budges on the Assad question and maybe hedges it slightly, I don't think there's any likelihood of progress in the near term. And I think you're likely to see the situation getting worse because you're going to have these talks going on in Vienna. But frankly, it's the facts on the ground. It's a military fight between the rebels and the Iranians and the Russians and the regime, which is in a sense going to determine the political balance that may or may not open up a diplomatic track.
And I wonder how Assad looks at Iran being invited to the table. And I'm just wondering what you think about Assad's viewpoint now when it comes to doing business with Iran versus Russia, the secular versus the sectarian.
Well, I think for Assad, I mean, this is the Iranians being there, the Russians being militarily involved in Syria, effectively guarantees his position in the short term. I mean, both of these states have made their line very firm. There is no way around Assad at the moment, and the Russians particularly will not allow that. So I think clearly he's very satisfied with the trend. Clearly the diplomatic openings, the sense that the West is softening on his position, is something that will bring cheer to him. I mean, the question of Iranian-Russian rivalry in Syria is an unknown, but I think both are aligned for the moment over their defense of the Assad regime. There's clearly that kind of tactical convergence. Now, there have been mutterings from within the regime of extended Iranian influence, of them exerting too much control, and I think Assad will clearly look to leverage the two off each other, and arguably Assad bits closer into the Russian camp because the Russians want to preserve the central state, they want to preserve the institutions, whereas the Iranians are happy to work through non-state actors, through a retrenched Syria, even through a more chaotic situation that might actually not favor Assad in the long term in terms of preserving his control over a state entity.
Hassan, it seems that every country who's involved in this, whether it's a proxy war or not, agrees that there is no military solution. What is the next step, though, to getting some sort of political solution if this fighting on the ground and in the skies keeps going on?
Well, I think just if we look at the recognition of the fact that we have to include everybody involved in the Syrian crisis at the table, the recognition of the role of regional actors is it's an indicator of what a pragmatic, strategic, more pragmatic, let's say, strategic behavior on the parties that ignited those sort of, supporting those people fighting in Syria. I think accepting and not excluding Iran and other parties is key to any settlement in the future. I think this more pragmatic way of dealing with the Syrian political process will bring more than what we had until now. Now, Iran is invited, Egypt might be invited or have already been invited to the political process. I think this is creating a sort of balance of narratives. The narratives that have been there previously were saying that the nature of the Syrian crisis is a sectarian one and Assad must go. Now, the counter narratives on the negotiating table, I think this is gonna bring more and more pragmatism to the negotiating table, and at last I think I'm more actually optimistic about the future because this sort of bringing all parties will make the parties, the extremist party on the negotiating table more
let's leave it there, because
pragmatic
obviously
in their dealing.
A resolution is needed because the longer it takes, the bigger the refugee crisis that we are seeing, particularly in Europe. Thank you very much to my guests, Arron Reza Merat, Hassan Ahmadian and Julian Barnes-Dacey. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme's page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story, or me at Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.